Our introduction. Hello, everyone. So I'm Jonah Lacqua. I'm Executive Director of the History Project. For those of you who are not familiar, we are Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We have been around since 1980. We are volunteer driven and we document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history in the Boston area predominantly, but you know Boston, that means Provincetown and Western Massachusetts and New England. So we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Melissa Homestead here tonight to talk about her new book. But before I introduce Melissa, I'm going to plug a couple of things we have going on. We at the History Project have a very busy April and May at this point. We will be doing a few events online still as the pandemic continues. Our next one is next Thursday, April 15th. We're doing an event on the history of LGBTQ immigration and migration from the 1950s to today. And that'll be a panel discussion featuring perspectives of scholars, lawyers, asylum seekers, and historians. And that's sponsored by Mass Humanities. So you can learn more about that and sign up on our website or on our Eventbrite. And 2 weeks from now, we're holding a panel discussion following a free screening of the documentary Cured. And Cured highlights a pivotal but little known moment in LGBTQ history when activists rose up to challenge a formidable institution and won. It's basically the story of changing the DSM Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness by the APA. It's a great documentary. It's going to be on GBH this fall, I've heard. But we're going to get a sneak peek and we'll have a panel discussion with the directors of the documentary and local psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Pillard. So stay tuned, come back and join us for those. And if you like what you do and you are interested in supporting us, we appreciate all the help we can get. We are a community-driven organization and we are here because of support of our donors and friends like you. So please share our events and I'll put a couple links in the chat so you can follow back up with us. But without further ado, tonight we have the pleasure of a presentation by Dr. Melissa Homestead. Melissa is professor of English and program faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. A graduate of Smith College, which is how we met each other. My wife is a Smithy and mentioned, have you heard about the Willa Cather book? It's on, the Smithies are talking about it. And so we connected. But anyway, Dr. Melissa Homestead is a graduate of Smith College and the University of Pennsylvania. She's published widely on American women's writing and authorship from the late 1700s through the early 1900s. She serves as director of the Cather Project and associate editor of the Complete Letters of Willa Cather, a digital edition. Dr. Homestead's new book, The Only Wonderful Things, The Creative Partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, is now available via Oxford University Press, and I will put a link in the chat so that folks can follow up there. And with that, Melissa, I turn it over to you, and I'm available for questions and Q&A, so feel free to use the chat, folks.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and I'm happy presenting virtually to the History Project in Boston from my kitchen table in Lincoln, Nebraska. So Jonah Lacqua tells me there's a strong interest in programming focusing on lesbian history, and in line with this emphasis in my talk and in my home Zoom location, I'm happy to report that there will be a parade of cats. So we have, so far we have, this is Annabelle, and there may be 3 more if you're lucky. And if I'm lucky, also there will be no cat fight on my kitchen table or in my lap. So my book started circulating earlier than Oxford University Press led me to believe. So there's a small chance 1 or more of you may have already read my book or started exploring it, but I'm sure most of you haven't. So my presentation is going to be in 2 parts. First, I'll give a brief overview of the book, chapter by chapter, accompanied by images. And then I'll return to some points with a particular New England slant and some questions of method and evidence. So there are 2 strands of argument throughout my book, signaled in my title by the phrase creative partnership. First, is that as two ambitious career women, Willa Cather and Edith Lewis created a romantic and domestic partnership that allowed them to enjoy love and intimacy and to pursue their ambitions. Second, that as an editor, Lewis was a partner in Cather's creative process. This is a page from Cather's novel, The Professor's House. All that handwriting is Edith Lewis's handwriting. And also used her expertise in advertising to help craft Cather's image as an author. My book starts and ends at the old burying ground in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where Cather and Lewis are buried side by side. I hope that by the end of the book, I've succeeded in undoing the mythology about the gravesite that has obscured Lewis's place in Cather's life. Having started at the end with my own visit to Jaffrey in the autumn of 1984, Mountain Day at Smith College, I turned the clock back, introducing Edith Lewis as the young woman Willa Cather first met in Lincoln, Nebraska in August 1903 at the home of Sarah Harris, publisher of the Lincoln Courier. Sarah Harris is neither of these people. I think that's her mother and her brother, but that's the house precisely in 1903 when Willa Cather and Edith Lewis met there, and the house is still standing. Delving briefly into Lewis's New England family history, which stretches far back as the Mayflower, I paint a picture of her family's life in Nebraska before she herself emerged into public view as an adolescent, studying at the University of Nebraska and publishing short stories in the Lincoln Courier. She's in the lower right there with her sorority sister from Delta Gamma. She transferred to Smith College in Massachusetts, where she met Oxa Barlow, who's an important character in the book, and from which she graduated in 1902. And she's with her literary society in the back row. I have more to say about Smith later. Chapter 2 follows Lewis to New York City, where she moved, where she moved after a year back in Lincoln teaching school. And I trace the growth of her relationship with Cather, both personal and professional, from their first meeting in 1903 through about 1918. This picture is the corner of South Washington Square, where she moved in 1903. The building with the round lintel on the left is 60 South Washington Square, and Willa Cather moved into that brimming house when she moved to New York in 1906. From 1906, both Cather and Lewis worked at McClure's magazine, and I argued that the magazine office was the crucible of their collaborative work on Cather's fiction. This is actually a poem that Cather published in McClure's, and that's Edith Lewis's handwriting, editing it for publication. In my book, I argue that Cather and Lewis, in choosing to make a home together in 1908, and this is the building where they moved in 1908 off Washington Square, we're emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. And you may be familiar with this picture. Sarah Orne Jewett, the author, is on the left, Annie Fields is on the right. Identified by most scholars as the prototypical Boston marriage, a question, again, that I'll return to later. In any event, after Cather left McClure's, Lewis moved on to Every Week magazine, where she was managing editor, and I recover Lewis's work as an editor of fiction there. These two images on the right is an illustration from Cather's novel, My Antonia, and on the left is a story that Edith Lewis commissioned for Every Week magazine, and they both used the same illustrator at the same time, and he used the same artist's model. It's the same woman, the same clothes, both of them drawn, and they're images of Scandinavian immigrants on the Great Plains. So they really were thinking together throughout. In chapter 3, I turn back the clock to 1915 to tell the story of Cather and Lewis's 4 shared trips to the US Southwest. And this is the 2 of them at Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Throughout the book, Lewis's editing of Cather's fiction is a key theme, but I linger over the evidence here because the first surviving edited type draft of one of Cather's novels is The Professor's House, which was grounded in their 1915 and 1916 shared trips. And this is actually a map that Edith Lewis drew in 1915, recording some details of their trip. Their Southwestern travels in 1925 and 1926, and that's when these photographs were taken, inspired Death Comes for the Archbishop. Although there's no type draft of that novel, there's a rich record of their travel and literary collaboration. After reminding the record of their time together in the desert Southwest, I focus in chapter 4 on Edith Lewis's career as an advertising copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Company. arguing that her advertising copy for soap and hand lotion and Cather's fiction are in conversation with one another. This is actually something I found very early in my research, and it's one of my favorite things. On the left is an installment of a Cather story, Uncle Valentine, published in the Woman's Home Companion in 1925. And on the right is an advertisement for Jergens lotion, for which Edith Lewis wrote the advertising copy. And right there they are, right next to each other in a magazine. I also hypothesized that Lewis was behind the famous Edward Steichen portrait of Cather, published in Vanity Fair. Lewis worked extensively with Steichen on advertising campaigns. And on the right is a famous picture he took for a Jergens lotion ad. And you see it signed Steichen, and there's Willa Cather in a photograph with Steichen's name under it in Vanity Fair magazine. Lewis started in advertising in 1919, and she and Cather first summered on Grand Manan Island in 1922. And that's when I believe that these pictures were taken. And those are the pictures that are on the book jacket. They devote a separate chapter to their many summers there, both before and after they built their own cottage at Whale Cove. Cather has been portrayed as living in isolation on the island, but she was living with Edith Lewis, who was actually the legal owner of the land and the cottage. And there's their cottage. This is one of my other favorite objects. It's a little photograph. This is also on the cover of their cottage. Edith Lewis tinted it with watercolors, and Willa Cather wrote at the top, "This is our little home." Furthermore, at Whale Cove, they were part of a community of women, and only women. And I'm going to get back to Whale Cove in a minute. In this chapter, I focus both on their collaborative work on stories collected in the volume Obscure Destinies, which was published in 1932. And this is Edith Lewis editing one of those stories, and how both of them responded to the deaths of their parents in the late 20s and early 30s. And those two things are closely related. I also see them as moving past grief in the 1930s by inviting sisters and nieces to visit them on the island. And this, in fact, is Willa Cather with her niece, Mary Virginia Auld, who graduated from Smith College as well, class of 1929. And so you can see that sort of way that their families became integrated with one another. In my last chapter, I take them back to New York City, where they settled in a large apartment at 570 Park Avenue in 1932. This is a modern photograph, of course. In 1927, they had lost their Greenwich Village apartment to subway construction and camped out in an apartment hotel for 5 years before they finally leased another apartment. They made their lives together there and built relationships with each other's family and with the Menuhin family. Yehudi Menuhin is the most famous of the musical siblings, and he also had two sisters, Hepzibah and Yalta, and their parents, and both Cather and Lewis were very close to all of them. Both of them, Cather and Lewis, also died in this apartment, 25 years apart. Long ago, the late Sue Rosowski, an English professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a Cather scholar, suggested to me that recovering Lewis's life and relationship with Cather might restore the integrity of Lewis's grief at Cather's death. Appropriately, Lewis's profound grief after Cather's death occupies a significant portion of this chapter. The years after Cather's death, which was in 1947, correspond to the Cold War panic over homosexuality called by one historian the Lavender Scare. In my epilogue, I consider how this context enabled some to deny Cather's lesbian sexuality and to refuse to see Lewis for what she was and for what she'd been in Cather's life. Although Edith Lewis was born and raised in Nebraska and she and Cather lived together in New York City, New England is key to Lewis's story and to the story of her relationship with Cather. I, like Edith Lewis, am a graduate of Smith College. Me at my 30th reunion, there I am. My 35th reunion was a webinar at this kitchen table as well. We all know how May was. And this is, as I often say, how I got myself into this mess of spending 18 years researching and writing this book. The concrete traces of Lewis's life at Smith are scant, although I have gone back to the archives again and again. So I've got here her transcript, I've got records from her literary society, and I've done as much as I possibly can with those. But I don't really have any evidence of her emotional or romantic life during her college years. Although Edith Lewis was friends with Ruth Hawthorne French, a daughter of one of her father's Dartmouth classmates, she doesn't appear in Ruth's scrapbook. And this is this marvelous document here, which richly documents this all-female social world at Smith College. And yet I really feel that Smith and its social and intellectual world of women, so unlike the coeducational land-grant university where she started her education and where I teach, and from which Willa Cather graduated, shaped Lewis and made her who she was when she first met Cather in 1903. Just because I love these pictures so much, here are Edith's classmates, Ruth French, this is from her scrapbook, and Catherine Holmes together. The one on the left is from the scrapbook, and I just think that's such an amazing picture. And I think it's a slightly later picture that's in one of their files. And I know that Ruth had a high-profile public life in Boston. She was involved with the YMCA, the AAUW, war work. She lived on Pinckney Street. And I know that Catherine wrote her Smith Alumni Quarterly obituary, but I want to know the story of this relationship, and I wish somebody else would do it. I'm probably not going to do it, but anyway, many, if not all of you, have heard of the Boston marriage tradition, represented by Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Field. So here they are, they've come back again. And surpassing the love of men, romantic friendship, and love between women from the Renaissance to the present, Lillian Faderman juxtaposes Jewett and Fields with Cather, locating what she sees as a strong break between the innocence accorded Jewett and Fields and other female couples in the 19th century New England, and the knowledge of modern lesbian sexuality represented by Cather. Most queer readings of Cather are premised on the notion that she lived in an early 20th century closet, hiding her lesbian identity from the world. Although changes of time and place have consequences in Cather and Lewis's story, I nevertheless find persistence of something like the Boston marriage tradition in the relationship. And in particular, the fact that the relationship, even if it wasn't named, was not hidden and was quietly socially recognized by family and friends. I have also become convinced, despite all of the statements one reads in scholarship about what a Boston marriage was, socially accepted in New England between socioeconomically privileged women, that we really don't know what a Boston marriage was, even in the case of Jewett and Fields, which is why my planned next book is going to be a dual biography of Jewett and Fields. And if I say that enough, maybe I will actually research and write that book. A book that I didn't read until after I finished my own book, Between Women, Friendship, Desire, and Marriage in Victorian England, has given me some new ways to think about Cather and Lewis. In Marcus's discussion of what she identifies as a socially recognized institution of the female marriage in Victorian England, Marcus draws a distinction between subcultures and networks. Looking at lesbian life from the perspective of the mid-20th century, we're accustomed to looking for lesbian subcultures, like the lesbian bar, for example. But Marcus argues that couples in female marriages in the 19th century in England were part of social networks that, while they included other female couples, also included straight married couples. Put another way, these couples were not part of a lesbian subculture. One of the reasons that I think Cather and Lewis as a couple have seemed invisible as such, or have seemed to have been closeted, is that there was an emerging lesbian subculture in Greenwich Village, where they lived until 1927. And they were not, as far as I've been able to determine, a part of it. Although if somebody ever finds the list of like the Bank Street lesbian potluck schedule, let me know. I want to make a distinction between how Cather and Lewis function as a couple in two other New England settings, Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and Grand Manan Island. Now, of course, Grand Manan is not part of the United States, and thus is not technically part of New England, even though the island is closer to the coast of the state of Maine than to the coast of the Canadian territory of New Brunswick, of which it's a part. Nevertheless, the Whale Cove community of which Cather and Lewis became a part, beginning in 1922, is where I see Cather and Lewis functioning as part of a woman-only subculture. The Whale Cove group was founded in the early 20th century by three women who graduated from the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics, a training school for gym teachers, for female gym teachers. One of them married a man and moved west, and another classmate bought out her share of the property. Through at least 1940, as far as I can tell, only women owned or rented at Whale Cove. And although center of gravity in terms of guests and owners shifted from the Boston area to New York City, it was essentially a New England phenomenon. So, oops, there we go. I traveled with my senior basset hounds to New Brunswick a decade ago, tracking the real estate transactions in and around the Whale Cove Inn and doing my best to recover at least a little of the lives of the women Cather and Lewis knew there. Whale Cove wasn't exclusively a lesbian community. It was more lesbian-ish, I would say. In addition to romantic couples, there were pairs of sisters, widowed mothers with their daughters, and nieces as guests, including Cather's nieces. On the sisters' front, Cather and Lewis were good friends with Alice and Mabel Jordan. Alice on the left was a children's librarian at the Boston Public Library. And while her sister, Mary Adela Jordan, founded the Kimberly School for Girls in Montclair, New Jersey, with her Smith College classmate, Mary Waring. So Mary Waring is on the left in this picture and from the Smith College archives, and Mary Jordan is on the right. My favorite lesbian couple at the resort are Ethelwyn Manning, also a Smithy. There's Smithies everywhere if you look for them, and her partner, Catherine Schwartz. Now, Manning was head of reference at the Frick Art Reference Library in Manhattan, although she was originally from the Boston area. And this is a prominent enough figure to find a picture of her, and she's super femme. But Catherine Schwartz, I don't know, haven't been able to find a picture of her. Cather and Lewis spent many summers as part of this community from 1922 to 1940. As the women who owned property there died off, and because they didn't have children to inherit their cottages, the lesbian history of this community was lost and denied by nieces and nephews who inherited it and turned it into a family resort. In Jaffrey, New Hampshire, Cather and Lewis stayed at the Shattuck Inn, where they were, to use Marcus's terminology, part of a network rather than a subculture. Lewis spent less time here than did Cather. She had an office job in Manhattan after all. But she still spent more time there with Cather than has been recognized generally in scholarship on Cather. This picture, for example, was taken in Jaffrey in 1926 by a woman who was apparently part of their social network at the Shattuck Inn. The photographer was identified in the source where I found this photograph only as Mrs. Josiah Wheelwright. I'm pretty sure that's Lois Curtis Nelson Wheelwright, a 1921 graduate of Radcliffe, who was born and raised in Chicago, who in October 1926 had just married Josiah Wheelwright of Beacon Street in Boston. Cather and Lewis are on the town common, and the old meeting house is visible behind them to the left. So that's the far left-hand building in the corner. Earlier that summer, they had spent a month in the Southwest, first conducting research for Cather's novel Death Comes to the Archbishop, and then spending a week with Willa's brother Roscoe and his family, his wife Meta and 3 daughters, one of whom went to Smith College. See, I can bring Smith College into every sentence. After Lewis boarded a train to return to Manhattan, Cather had planned to spend time writing at Mabel Lujan's compound in Taos, New Mexico, where Cather and Lewis had spent 2 weeks together the year before. However, it didn't suit Cather, and New York City was too hot to write. So in August, with no room available at the Shattuck Inn, Cather asked to be accommodated at the McDowell Colony, not far from Jaffrey. While she was at the McDowell Colony, Edith Lewis went on her own to Grand Manan to purchase land at Whale Cove and to make arrangements for construction of their own cottage, which was ready for them by the summer of 1928. Before that, they had rented a cottage. So Lewis's smile says to me that she was feeling pleased with that purchase. I also suspect, however, that she was sad about the recent death of her father, who was buried in his family's plot in a country graveyard in East Claremont, New Hampshire. I would hazard a guess that she made a point of visiting his grave while she was in Jaffrey in the autumn of 1926. He had died in California in the middle of her time in New Mexico with Cather a couple months earlier. In any event, there they are, a couple, enjoying an autumn day in public, and a newly married young straight woman took a snapshot of them together. They would return to the Shattuck Inn together a number of times in future years. From the Shattuck Inn in 1936, Cather would write to Lewis the beautiful one surviving letter, from which I took the title from my book, The Only Wonderful Things. Lewis would care for Cather in their Park Avenue apartment through 2 medically difficult years at the end of Cather's life. Lewis would choose the old burying ground, just out of range in this picture, behind a meeting house, as Cather's final resting place. And she would design this beautiful headstone as a semi-public memorial to her dead partner. Cather left most of her assets, including books and papers, to Lewis and made her her literary executor, in which capacity Lewis commissioned a biography and wrote her own Cather. To return to Sharon Marcus's observation about female marriage and the questions of evidence, Marcus points to many practices that marked women as married to each other in Victorian Britain, such as being co-resident, caring for each other, caring for the bodies of each other in life and death. So in illness, making arrangements for burial, the intermingling of assets and the use of wills to convey property, including papers after death. While some would insist that we can't know whether such relationships between women were sexual, Marcus argues that a search for explicit written evidence about sex is wrong-headed because it is precisely discretion about sexual matters that mark marriage, both in the case of female couples and of legally married opposite-sex couples. As she points out, if we held other bodily experiences to the same standard that we do sexuality, then we might believe that partners in Victorian marriages never defecated or menstruated. So anyway, 38 and a half years living together openly is more than enough evidence for me that Willa Cather and Edith Lewis were a lesbian couple. So I also will just point out, I know that Joan was going to put a link to my book at the Oxford University Press website, but there's a discount code, which you can find at my website, and also a link if you want to not give Jeff Bezos your money and you want to order it, you can get 30% off. So thanks. And I'd be happy to take questions.
First of all, thank you so much. That was like a who's who. I made a note that Whale Cove sounds like a who's who of lesbianish women from the New England area. And I have a question. While folks are thinking about their questions, please feel free to use the chat or the hand raise function, or if you have your video on and you want to wave at me, I'll make sure you get unmuted. But I was wondering if you can, or if you would, tell me a little bit more about, where was my note? What was the last name of Ruth who lived on Pinckney Street? We do a walking tour of Beacon Hill. And
Ruth Hawthorne, yeah, Ruth Hawthorne, okay. French. And she in fact wrote a little book about the history of her block of Pinckney Street. And I really, she did not marry a man. That much I know. Whether or not she, had a partner, Catherine Holmes certainly looked like her partner. Catherine Holmes, I haven't been able to find out as much about. Her name is less distinctive, but Ruth Hawthorne, French, yes. And she was just you can find a lot about her because she was involved in so much sort of, public facing social work and advocacy work, so.
All right, excellent. Yeah, we have Annie Fields and Sarah Orton Jewett's apartment is now a parking garage. On Charles Street. So we usually point that out on the tour, but I'd love to highlight some more women who live.
Well, it was a parking garage in the 1930s already. Oh, wow. Willa Cather wrote to Ferris Greenslet at Houghton Mifflin to confirm that story. Apparently Annie Fields was so averse to it becoming some kind of museum that she requested that the property be torn down after she died. So.
Wow. And for those who don't know, Annie Fields' unpublished diaries are at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So yeah, so we have a question from Ken in the chat. And Ken says, amazing, how does the Willa Cather Museum in Red Wing deal with her being a lesbian?
Red Cloud. And they deal with it, yes, they deal with it much better than they used to. There is, let's see, I think it was 2017 when they opened the new exhibit space, which provides an orientation for visitors, and they devoted a panel to Edith Lewis, which they let me edit So yes, and in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I did a benefit event for the National Willa Cather Center in Red Cloud. So yes, they do much better than they did. The founder of the National, what was called the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial when it was first founded, she and Edith Lewis did not get along. And for good reasons on Edith Lewis's part. And there was a lot of, she spread a lot of misinformation. In fact, Mildred Bennett was the source of a lot of misinformation about Edith Lewis. So.
Wow.
And I'm on the board of governors of the National Willa Cather Center, and I'm not the only, like there's another lesbian, there are a couple of gay men on the board, so it is very different than it once was.
And I don't want to speak for Ken, but there are museums around here who are going through similar transformations in how they're interpreting some of the people who lived in the homes that are now museums, or who were patrons of the museums in the area. And so I have a hand raised from, the name on here says Eddy and Jackie, if you would like to unmute and go ahead.
My question is about the relationship between Willa Cather and Sarah Orne Jewett.
Mm-hmm. What about, yes.
Just talk a little bit about the influence that was there.
So Willa Cather met Sarah Orne Jewett in 1908. At that point, Willa Cather was in Boston working on an expose on Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science for McClure's magazine, and she met Sarah Orne Jewett, whose work she had been reading with great interest since she was a student in college, at least, I think. You'll find as a set piece in a lot of criticism the notion that, Sarah Orne Jewett would write about relationships between women and Willa Cather wouldn't. And that's kind of and Sarah Orne Jewett wrote a famous letter of advice to Willa Cather where she said, don't have a male narrator or use a male perspective. And that's been played as, showing the huge rupture and difference between the 19th century and the 20th century. And certainly Cather's work in a lot of respects was different from Jewett's work in that respect. But I really take it that Cather followed Jewett's model in life, even if she didn't follow it in art. That she was deeply influenced by seeing seeing Jewett and Fields together in their home. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I scared up a couple of more of Cather's letters to Annie Fields that were in the hands of Mitchell Adams. Some of you may know who Mitchell Adams is. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, I think, and I never got to actually meet him. I was supposed to meet him once and see his Annie Fields artifacts in person. He was Annie Fields' great nephew. But there were a couple more letters that I had seen footnoted somewhere. And you can just really see the fact that, Cather had just moved into this apartment with Edith Lewis, and that Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields knew about the fact that she was starting this new home and were interested in it. And she's reporting on their new apartment. So that's part of what I would, refer to. So.
Excellent. And so we have a couple of questions from Drew in the chat. And the first is, Drew says, it seems that Cather was conflicted about her same-sex attractions. The portrayal of a butch lesbian in The Old Beauty seems filled with a type of self-loathing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Again,
I would say I'm looking at the life more than the art. And I don't see self-loathing in a life that she lived, I think, happily and richly with another woman for 38 and a half years. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. So Drew's follow-up question is also, do you think that Isabel McClung was the love of Cather's life? No. I mean, so I think that the record is kind of complicated, and there was definitely some awkwardness. But I think you want to read the book. I mean, I just think that there is a lot to Edith Lewis and that relationship that if you have read other Cather biographies, I mean, I think for people who have written Cather biographies, Isabel McClung is kind of safe because she went off and married a man. And so Cather can pine for this woman who went off and married a man. And so therefore that kind of protected Cather from being too lesbian, like her relationship. Of course, this makes no sense to any of us. We would say, of course, that's not the way it works. But, and even Sharon O'Brien's biography, which is the sort of one that came out in 1987 that made the big play for Cather as a lesbian, really only goes up to 1915, and Sharon never wrote the second half of that biography. So I just think that there is so much more to Cather's relationship with Edith Lewis, and I think that Isabel McClung has been overplayed.
So Drew has one more comment, and then I have a couple more questions in the chat. And please, folks, feel free to put your questions in, or again, if you want to do the hand raise feature or wave at me on camera, and I'll make sure that we call on you. Drew mentions Cather's treatment of Louis Marcellus in the
Yes.
professor's house seems a type of revenge on Hamburg for taking Isabel away from her.
Yeah, and again, that's what everybody and all the other biographies will tell you, and I will tell you something different. I mean, I do think that it's it is that to some degree, but Isabel McClung got married in 1916. Willa Cather started living with Edith Lewis in 1908. So complicated, overlapping, certainly, but I think that you just kind of have to give Edith Lewis some attention and not make everything about the woman that Cather didn't spend most of her adult life living with.
And Drew says, thank you for answering their questions. So speaking of Edith Lewis, Andrew asks, Lewis lived for many years after Cather died. What do we know about her life for those 25 years?
I know so much more than it is in the book because I have kind of a lopsided archive. I found about 600 Edith Lewis letters in archives, but only about 10% of them were written before Cather's death. So I actually have and a lot of them are about managing the literary estate, and they're kind of technical. And I used to be an intellectual property paralegal, so I actually find them very interesting, but they wouldn't have been very interesting for this book. She spent a lot of time managing the literary estate, working on the biography. There's complicated things that happen there and that are the subject of the epilogue of my book. She made new friends. She traveled. She had a very good friend who died in the early 1940s, relatively young, when he was about 50, John Chapin Mosher, who was a very, very out gay man, the film critic for the New Yorker. And I think that Edith Lewis really liked the company of gay men as friends. And so she had a couple so Stephen Tennant, George Cates, Patrick Ferry, these are three men who I found traces of her friendships with them, which I think some people have thought like, well, again, Edith Lewis must really be straight if she went traveling with these people. No, Stephen Tennant is just about as gay as can be. And I do think it really was just that she was kind of a lesbian fag hag. And as a lesbian fag hag myself, I sort of resonated with that. And then she spent 10 years as an invalid with private nurses, and the last private nurse socially isolated her to get control of her finances, took stuff and sold it. It's really kind of bad. So, and I say a little bit about that in the book, but that accounts for the last 10 years of her life. So.
And so more questions in the chat. We have Rob, who I think, Rob, you mentioned you're an UNL alum, right? Yep. And Rob wants to know if you could talk a bit about how you ended up at University of Nebraska and the intersection of your Cather scholarship with being at UNL.
I was hired as a Cather specialist. So That's exactly how I ended up. You have a PhD in English, you go where there are jobs. I was at the University of Nebraska, and most of my scholarship actually had been on women of an earlier period, popular novelists. But I started working on this project on Cather and Lewis in 2003. And they were looking to hire somebody to work on Cather at the University of Nebraska. And I left the University of Oklahoma for Nebraska. So that's how that happened. But I also wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on Willa Cather in 1984. And so I have a very long, complicated relationship with Willa Cather's works. And being here in Nebraska, though, because Edith Lewis was from Nebraska, I have there are places that the house that Edith Lewis grew up in isn't standing. It was taken down by 1945, but like I walk my dogs over and like look at where it used to be sometimes, just be like, there's where Edith grew up again. Spent all this time, searching property records and Lancaster County Register of Deeds office. Have done other sorts of research that being in Nebraska. And then also we do have the most amazing collections of Cather materials, and it turns out Edith Lewis materials, because Edith Lewis left all the papers in the apartment to Cather's niece and nephew, Helen Cather Southwick and Charles Cather, who were a brother and sister. And then they ended up donating their papers to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And they were sort of like Willa Cather's papers, but really they were also Edith Lewis's papers. And a lot of stuff that nobody but me would know who it was. I'm like, oh my God, that was her friend from Hatfield House who wrote that letter, right? All these letters to Edith Lewis that otherwise people would have absolutely no idea who they are. So that was fun.
Yeah, and Rob's follow-up question is, what street was that Lewis house on?
27th and N on the, let me think about this a second. It would be the southwest corner of 27th and N is where Lewis grew up. And there are two mid-century limestone facade duplex buildings there now.
Mm-hmm. And so I put a link to the Willa Cather archive in the chat, so folks can go and check it out.
Including, you can find, yes, there's a ton of stuff, including, we're still working on the letters publication. You may have read that the selected letters came out in 2013, but that was only about 18% of the letters, and we're about 2/3 of the way through digital publication of the complete letters. And so you can read those. It's free and available, and you can search them. So
yeah, it's amazing. I was poking around a little bit in preparation for tonight, and it is an intense and large digital archives. It's awesome. And so we have a question from Bjorn about Whale Cove. Is the cottage still standing? What's still there? Is there anything to look at?
Yes. So there was an inn and properties that could be rented. And then these cottages that were built by various women, or older cottages, existing cottages that they bought and renovated and sometimes moved around. And the Cather Lewis cottage, people will say it's the only house Willa Cather ever owned. It's like, no, Edith Lewis owned it. Anyway, it actually was nearly fallen down when Lewis, when she was old and ill, signed it over to Willa Cather's niece, Helen Cather Southwick, who kind of reconstructed it. And there were a number of problems with the cottage that they solved, including putting like a concrete slab because it would just get like water ran under it, and they had a big infestation of rats one year, and it was pretty primitive, and it didn't have plumbing, it didn't have electric, and so it's still there. It's owned by Helen's son Jim, and he allows the owner, Laura Buckley, the owner of the Whale Cove Inn and Cottages, to rent it out. So that picture I showed you, one of the pictures, I actually stayed in the cottage with my basset hounds, so that was fun.
That's awesome.
But it is difficult to get there. You have to take a ferry that takes several hours, and you really need a car. There's no way to get around if you don't have a car. So
So a little bit less easy than taking a stroll down or a stroll on Beacon Hill, which is not where Willa Cather lived. But sort of speaking of that, Ken is asking in the chat if you could tell us a bit more about your intended work on Jewett and Fields.
It's just a grand idea. I just thought there was just a moment when I was reviewing a whole bunch of recent criticism, scholarly criticism, and I was also thinking, what am I going to do next? And it came to me, and also was reading, the most recent. There's a couple of biographies of Fields that came out about 20 years ago, and there's also a couple of Jewett biographies, and I just don't, it just was really clear to me that they didn't do the relationship justice. And there is also just this, you will find statements in scholarship which basically say, well, because they were so forthright about how much they loved one another and didn't hide that, that means they couldn't have, right? So there's just this idea that if they were, if they were just open about how much they loved each other, it couldn't have been like a romantic or a sexual relationship, really. And I just find that so incredibly troubling that way. And I'm even talking about, scholarship from like a lesbian and gay studies perspective. There's this idea that there would have to be self-consciousness or shame or hiding. And I just want to break through that. I think it would be a very different book from this one because there is a big archive of a much more straightforward kind. And I also spent, I'd say, the first dozen years working on this book saying I wasn't writing biography. And then I did. And so I also think that I'm just going to go in and say, all right, I'm going to write a dual biography of these two women and let me just work my way through everything pretty systematically. So.
Ken says that you were invited to Jewett's home in, is it South Berwick, Maine? I still haven't been myself. I think that
I've been there
last summer.
Yeah. I've been there. Yeah. I'm a big Jewett fan. So that's another motivation. I think Country the Pointed Firs, I've recently decided it's going to displace My Antonia as my favorite book. So I think it deserves it.
There's when the time comes, there's this really interesting artifact, if people want to hear a quick non sequitur, or man, my thesaurus is not working tonight, my personal thesaurus. Anyway, at Harvard Medical School, there is this silver cup that was given to one of the Warrens when he retired. And both Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett's names are inscribed on the cup as being part of the group of women who gave this ornate cup to the Warren on the occasion of his retirement. And so it's I can't think of which Dr. Warren it is. There's the Warren of the Warren Anatomical Museum, and then there's a son and a grandson, and but it's at Harvard Medical School, and so it's like this little hidden lesbian artifact in the Warren Anatomical Museum. So well, I look forward to seeing the scholarship on Jewett and Fields. Boston marriages, I start to feel like where there's smoke, there's fire, right? How can you say somebody was partners with someone for a lifetime and then try to claim that they were just good friends? I don't know.
But and there's just even the questions about evidence and what counts as sex. I mean, there's just so many. There's just so many reasons that I just feel like we need to go back and work through that, right? And also the idea that James T. Fields, to whom Annie Fields was married before he died, kind of like arranged the relationship, also seems to make it seem like it couldn't be a lesbian relationship to some people. I mean, there's just all sorts of weird dynamics there. Yeah.
Well, we'll learn more moving forward. So it's still in the chat, and folks, we still have like, about 10 minutes left. I like to let people leave right around 8 so that we can, have a drink or dinner or whatever we're doing on this Thursday evening. So there's still time for questions. So please feel free to keep putting them in the chat. But Richard asks or says, I visited the grave at Jaffrey years ago when I lived there, and I always felt that Edith's small stone juxtaposed to Willa's large memorial was a way to downplay the relationship. Do you feel I'm seeing that wrong?
Oh, there's that story. The story about the grave. I begin and end at the grave. That stone was placed by people who didn't know who Edith Lewis was and didn't even get her birth year right. So she actually requested that no stone be placed. And then people would say, oh, was she trying to hide herself? No, it all has to do with complicated cemetery rules, I think, because she had created that beautiful stone, that beautiful headstone. And the only way that you could put a marker on the grave, you couldn't put another marker except a foot marker. That was like the rules, because that's the whole patriarchal model. Think of cemeteries, and you have like Jones, and it's often like the patriarch, and then you have the little markers with, the wife, the unmarried children, whatever, or you add something to the main headstone. There was no room on that headstone to squeeze Edith Lewis in, and I don't think she wanted a foot marker either. So she asked to be buried without a marker. But then the selectmen of the town of Jaffrey, New Hampshire, a few years after she died, thought it was unbecoming for the secretary of Willa Cather not to have a marker, and so they put it on there. And then it was put at the foot, and then it was relocated, and then it was, there's just this whole kind of absurd story which has to do with other people and has actually nothing to do with Edith Lewis. So, yeah.
And now we know.
And now we know, right. But when I first saw it in 1984, the marker was at the foot of the grave, and there's a series of Cather scholars who were like, Edith Lewis got herself buried at Willa Cather's feet.
That's not how graves work, but
I know, but that's what people did. And like I said, it's just it actually has nothing to do, it has nothing to do with her. So.
So Pam in the chat mentioned that Cather or Lewis, one of the two, wrote about Mary Baker Eddy. Were they open to religion? Were they interested, or was that a writing assignment?
Willa Cather was assigned to the Mary Baker Eddy expose. So that was an assignment. Edith Lewis was sent up every month to help read proof as the installments were coming out. So she was involved to some extent, although she had, she was about a decade younger than Cather. And so she had more of a, lower level job at the magazine at that point. Edith Lewis was raised a Unitarian here in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the church records are fun and crazy. I have some fun with that in chapter 1. There's this whole it's actually first Universalists who think the Unitarians want to take them over. I mean, it's all small town liberal religion stuff, but they didn't, neither one of them had any regular religious practice or affiliation while they were, living together in New York City.
So we still have a couple minutes left if anyone has any other questions that they would like to ask Dr. Homestead. I know that I need to get the book. I meant to order it before our talk, but it just came out last week, right? Officially?
Well, officially it came out April 1st, but in reality it came out March 1st, which, yeah, as long as you were ordering directly from Oxford University Press, it came out pretty much started shipping on March 1st. So
it's had a little time to be out there in the world. And I
Yes.
will make sure, folks, everyone who signed up tonight, I send a follow-up email with links that we shared in the chat. I will send the link to Dr. Homestead's website that has the discount code for the Oxford University Press copy of the book, so that if you would like to also pick this up, you can do that.
And I have talked to it is a university press, but I have talked to a few non-academics who have read it, and I was just very nervous and thought, could you really read it? And they absolutely could. So I just want to assure you that this is not, it doesn't read like it's deeply researched, and I have some arguments that have to do with academic stuff, but it really is, it's a story, and I think that you will find it accessible.
Which is excellent. And I look forward to picking it up. And I see it looks like someone might be writing in the chat, but I will close out tonight. And if there's another question, I'll read it out loud. But I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to reading the book. I love the Smith College connection. I think it's around here, I joke with my wife, there are Smithies everywhere, but there are a lot around here.
There aren't many in Nebraska, I gotta tell you.
Yeah.
I think there were more when Edith Lewis was growing up, and then seriously, I think there were probably more young women who went to Smith from Lincoln, Nebraska in the 1890s and the early 20th century than do now. So.
Oh, well, you'll have to start a chapter. Someone in the chat, we are everywhere, and I appreciate all of your Smith references. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I will, like I said, I'll have a follow-up email for you with links that I shared in the chat earlier in the conversation. But again, I hope to see you at some upcoming History Project events. We'll be doing history of LGBTQ migration and immigration next Thursday. In 2 weeks, we're doing a panel discussion on the documentary Cured. May, we have some, we haven't announced them yet, but you're here so you can hear about it, an event with a poet and singer from Lexington, Kentucky, who spent most of her life and career in Boston, and the Boston-Lexington lesbian connection. There is one. I didn't know there was, but it's a very interesting one. We're doing a couple events with Speak Out, and then that slides us right into Pride season. So stick around. And if you are interested in us, please be sure to stay on our mailing list, to check out our social media and website. We do events like these to make sure that we are sharing the history of our LGBTQ community with the public. And we are just so happy that you're here with us tonight. So it's 7:59. Go have your happy hour or your dinner, or like me, go to bed because it's late and it's finally dark out. And we will see you again soon. Thank you all.
Bye.